And so the backdrop for a lot of what we won't talk a lot about in detail in the 19th century in the United States is this backdrop of westward movement, wagon trains, manifest destiny. Oh, in the middle we fight this nasty, bloody, horrible civil war. We've been working on the backside, recovering from that. Europe has gone through tremendous warfare in the first part of the 19th century. They have several key things that happen in the middle part of the 19th century. In the last part of the 19th century is the rise of Germany, which changes the landscape for Europe politically and actually sets up most of what happens in the early part of the 20th century is being well set up by the end of the 19th century in the United States and also in Europe.
Did you say that, was it Louis the 14th?
Louis the 16th was the king that was king of France during the French Revolution.
And he died natural, or was he like?
No.
It was natural for what was going on.
He died he was executed by his people.
So it was like a coup?
Well, it wasn't a coup. It was a full-blown revolt by multiple classes of society.
Okay, and then
Napoleon actually rose out of the backside of the French Revolution. After France creates the French Republic out of the French Revolution, it reminds me so much of Roman history. Yeah, it's a republic, but people are vying for control of it. Napoleon is part of the group that does that and eventually rises to power fairly quickly, and then has himself proclaimed emperor in the process as that works through. And really the 19th century in a lot of ways is the century of France until the latter part of the 19th century when Europe becomes to be dominated to a great degree by the rise of a unified Germany under this one. But again, that's the backdrop. So remember, if we go back to the Reformation, where was Luther at? What part of the world? German. Although it's not the Germany we think of. It was that collection of principalities, 300, 400 principalities that existed there. So the German nation state doesn't rise until Bismarck, Prussia, and Austria really taking the lead in that in the latter part of the 19th century. Remember that most of Germany had been what? Protestant. That was the whole. They eventually came to that settlement of, whatever the ruler of the local area says goes, and you're allowed to do that. But most of Germany was Protestant. What was most of France, if you remember when we talked about France? Catholic. They had, remember, the Huguenots were the Protestants in France, and they eventually had been driven out. And so England is also Protestant, Anglican. We've talked so much about what flowed out of that, the various congregational movements. We spent the last 2 or 3 months really in those things, flowing out of what's going on the Anglican side of things. But things continued on in Europe after the Reformation, and after we switched over talking about England, things were still going on in Europe. There were a few more wars that had some religious flavor, although not quite as many after the Peace of Westphalia. Most of the wars in Europe became political versus religious. But the Catholic Church had, remember, called the Council of Trent in response to Luther, where they redeclared some of the things that they wanted to declare. And then things just sort of go on naturally with Catholicism for a good period of time. The other major Catholic nation in Europe is Italy's big. The other one is Spain. And remember, we've talked a little bit about this, but primarily Spanish explorers, Columbus, although he wasn't Spanish, but sailing under the flag of Spain, have settled the New World. So Spain has this very large carved out section of the New World. Basically everything that we think of south and up to and including the Rio Grande, and at that point early on, even the areas up through California and through Mexico and through there. So Spain has grown wealthy because of the part of the New World that they've landed in. One of the interesting, it's going to join up as a podcast topic, I'm sure, for us at some point, being a what if. What if Spain had actually landed more in the area of the English colonies, where they wouldn't have had the riches that were coming from the gold, the gold and all the other things that were there. It would have been very, yes, they would have had timber, and yes, they would have had other things, but not quite what they enjoyed out of Central and South America in terms of what thrust them forward. But Europe has pretty much divided itself to be Catholic and Protestant for most of this period of time, and it's become stabilized. During the first part when we were talking about post-Reformation, a lot of it had gone back and forth. Well, now it's pretty much things have settled down. More or less, the boundaries of countries have settled down. The unification of Germany under Bismarck is the real big thing that redraws the map of Europe, really during that 200-year period of time. But Catholicism is pretty, I don't want to say stagnant, although that's probably a fair word. It's pretty consistent from the period after the Council of Trent all the way through until the 19th century. And what we're going to pick up on next week when we watch one of Reeves's videos is sort of catching up on what's been going on with Catholic theology, particularly Catholic theology as we get towards the Vatican I conference, which is the next big ecumenical council that's called in the middle of the 19th century by Catholics. And we're going to see it's over the same thing that Luther was challenging. It's over papal authority. And so we're going to see how that plays out. We're also going to see at the same time that there's a movement actually going on inside of England, inside of the Anglican Church, that's called the Oxford movement. And during the Oxford movement, there's actually a sort of a reemergence of Catholicism in England. And actually where the argument there is that, yes, there is an Anglican Church, but it really is a proper branch or extension of the Catholic Church. It's been Catholic all along. There's lots of reasons. Reeve points it out very well in the video that we'll watch, that that's just not historically accurate. But it's nonetheless.
That's what the Americans said too, though, during the Revolution.
Yeah. But that's what was being argued. And so one of the elements that's going on there, even inside of a Protestant nation, inside of England, is the question of what does it mean to be Catholic? And the last little thing that we'll watch on this to sort of catch up the Catholic side of the branch here is, we talked so much about, I mentioned this I think a couple of weeks ago, American theology, American religion, American denominations are primarily Protestant, but yet we have Catholics. How do we have these Catholics? Where they come in these waves of immigration. There's a wave of Italian immigration. There's a wave of Irish immigration that comes, and Catholicism comes with those waves of immigrants because they were practicing in those. Ireland is still Catholic, if for no other reason than England is Protestant, so Ireland's going to be Catholic. If for no other reason than that.
Right.
But we'll see how all of that plays together as we sort of do the sweeping thing of the 19th century to catch up on the Catholic side of theology, because we've been spending so much time talking about the Protestant side of theology. And then sort of the last little place for us to go, in addition to picking up Baptist history through there, through the Civil War and post-Civil War, is to see the rise of the holiness elements inside of Methodism. So these are Pentecostals, Assemblies of God. How do they come into play? They come into play primarily around the turn of the 20th century. And then just a constant theme behind the scenes of all of this is humanism, for lack of a better term, modern humanism, the age of reason, which is now, we mentioned before, Newton wrote as much theology as he did science because they weren't divorced yet. But certainly in the 19th century, we come along and see the divorcing of science from theology in a major way, where what we experience today, where they are in conflict, comes to be, and comes to be pretty quickly. Any questions about that big overview? I thought that would be to give that big background, because we're going to be dancing through things of that, and I may use a term like manifest destiny, and we'll use it out of the blue, or we may talk about what's going on in Europe primarily. I think this is probably wrong. I think of the 19th century in Europe as the first half being France and sort of the second half being Germany in terms of what the dominant powers are going to be. It is easy to underestimate, even post-Napoleon, but certainly during how much influence France exerted on Europe. There was a time, believe it or not, 'cause you wouldn't believe that by seeing World War I and World War II. The French army was one of the best armies in the world, believe it or not. Particularly during that era, and there's a lot of ascendancy of France, which ties to the Catholic thing that we'll talk about in the middle of the 19th century. Questions about that? I feel like I wandered around in the desert there for a good bit.
So everybody knows I'm not a historian in the group. So other than Native Americans, who was like in the parts of the US that were west of the Rockies? Was it all just Native Americans? Were there no, I don't know, Chinese or somebody from the other side of the Pacific, Russian or?
Well, there was the period of time, remember we bought Alaska from the Russians. It's easy to forget that Russia had a fairly significant territorial area in North America. What do you think it was Alaska? You know, it's the big part there, and then the part that swings down, it's sandwiched in there between the Pacific and Canada. The Russian influence into North America was never overly populated, but they had that territory.
Yeah.
And they came down pretty far south. It's really not that, you get pretty close to Washington State, you get far enough south down in that. Eventually, there are a number of, well, you still see the Asian influence today in California. They came over primarily, though, during the Spanish and then subsequent, well, Mexican and then subsequent American occupation and control of California
A lot of them came
to build the
to
railroads.
build it.
Yeah, which were part of that expansion moving from east to west. That, you know, every Western you've ever seen, there's a town, and what's one of the big things in the middle of the town if you're a town? It's the station for the railroad. You know, the towns existed sometimes off the railroad, but not really in most of the Midwest.
No, not for very long.
Not for very long. And you know, it's not until the late 19th century, I guess that's right after the Civil War, 18, when it's the Promontory Point connection, it's 1869. So eventually we do connect where you can get all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast by rail. But before that, rail had been expanding tremendously towards the West, so much so that the Midwest, and what we think of as being the West, and we see a Western now, you know, we're talking generally there about the period from, well, 18, that could probably give us all, I know it could all give us less than the railroad history in the United States, but it's really 2 or 3 decades into the 19th century before railroads become big. But once they become big, they become big. And by the time of the American Civil War, they are the primary means by which troops are moving, by which material is moving. Part of what makes that war possible to happen on as wide a front as it does is you have the ability to move things by rail. That's huge. And that also changes the speed at which the expansion for the United States heads west. If you think about like a wagon train, you know, kind of approach to heading west, it took months to cross the United States by horse and by wagon or on foot. It took a while. It took multiple days or weeks to get across by rail, depending on what route you went and what you were able to afford and how you were able to do it.
4 days.
But you could get all the way from the East Coast after late 1860s to the West Coast in a matter of time. And that became a big part of what allowed the United States to fulfill what it believed to be was its manifest destiny. And it's sort of interesting because it's like we went all the way west, sort of skipping over a lot of the stuff in the middle, and then we came back and filled it back in. And that, you know, Oklahoma, you know, why do we call them Sooners? Because the Sooner comes from those who jumped the date and slipped in to go stake their claim inside of this territory that had been seized from the Native Americans. That's not until 1890, if my date's holding somewhere around 1890. California had been a state for a long time before this. There were a lot of territories still in the West. Texas had won its independence from Mexico, been an independent republic, and then become a state in 1845. But there were large parts of that middle part that were just passed over. And I heard somebody a couple of weeks ago, we talk about that sometimes, the flyover states now. they were roll-by states in the 19th century,
Yeah.
or roll
Yeah.
through states. You just rolled through them instead of really stopping. It also in the New World, Texas is sort of interesting in this since we're talking about the influence of Catholics. There were four primary ways that Catholics were incorporated into the United States. Most of them were by immigration. Irish immigration, a large bit of Italian immigration. But in the case of Texas, and in the case of California and territories that have been part of Spain or part of Mexico, citizens that were already there that stayed had been Catholic. And so, that's the reason we have Catholic influence in the state of.
And some in Louisiana too.
Yeah.
The Acadians.
True. They came down from Canada.
Yeah.
That was the other way. I think it was the wave of immigration. It wasn't quite European immigration, but it was,
Right.
but it was immigration nonetheless. And then you do have actually still a fair number of immigration that goes on to bring additional Protestants here. There's a large, as you well know, in Central Texas, towns like Fredericksburg and things that get names like Schulen. There's lots of Bergs. The reason there's lots of Bergs is because of German immigration that happened. Bergs and Bachs, Diefenbach and Schulenburg, and are the result of
New Berlin, a new.
yeah, are the result of German immigration that comes here. And those German immigrants are very much bring the Lutheran influence, very much Protestant coming from the German church. I'm going to shut up and ask if there's anything over the last couple of weeks that's out there lingering that you had questions about, or maybe you need to get clarification on.
The iPad.
I'm assuming the iPad is Diana. I'm hoping that's the case, but I don't.
Lori.
Or Lori. Could be Lori. Is that Lori?
It's me. It's
All right.
me. Yes, I've been
You've been-
trying not to.
We
You've
finally
been
got
lurking.
things up and going, right?
Yes, thank you so much.
Out there in the middle of those birds. isn't she?
Yeah, so, yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
questions?
Well, I know I didn't pay attention in history. I mean, that's pretty obvious, but like, did y'all actually get this much in history? And I just avoided it. I mean, you had to get this stuff, some of the stuff not in history. Just-
I don't know where I was during history time, but I'm not very good in history either.
Well, Kathy, my minor is in history in college, so that's where I got most of mine.
In college, and it's stuck because you were just that interested in it. I mean,
Yes,
I get it.
yes.
And see, I wasn't that
And her
interested
history
in
teacher
high
was
school
in her-
or college. And so I feel like I just lost it at
Yeah.
this
I learned
point.
it for the
You know, I
test, and that
remember
was it.
little
Yeah,
bits and
the
pieces.
the dates to me, like when I can't even remember stuff in my own life. Like, you know, what year did I actually do that? I mean, some things certainly I can, but I don't remember dates, and
Right.
that's
Well,
kind of sad.
I don't say I remember dates, but I remember, generalizations. Like I know, a lot of you took specific classes like Irish history and Russian history, and you learn. I mean, I don't remember dates, but I know general. This happened and this happened and this happened.
Yeah, I don't even know. I mean, I've heard of Louis the 16th, but
Hey, I'm right there with you,
You may know his
Kathy.
life-
One that came after the 15.
Yeah.
That'd be what I
that's
know.
pretty much what I know. That's right.
Yep,
I couldn't tell
Okay.
you.
that's,
But some of this inspires you to travel. So my study of history is part of the reason I love to travel, because I like to go see the things that I've read about. And then it kind of helps stick more. You learn as you travel and you see and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I love to travel, and I mean, I would like to do it. I just, when I've gone to places like I like it, but I don't remember the history that I learned. So I just, maybe it's just not my thing to remember the history of it. And
It's not on your, the top of your priority list.
yeah, that's,
You've
it's,
got too much medicine
yeah,
falling away in your memory banks.
Yeah.
yeah.
You
brain's
can only
just not-
stuff so much
yeah.
in there.
my brain's just-
And I think the challenge of history, because I've loved history for as long as I can remember, that's probably pretty obvious, but I think it's, the one hand, it's the big sweep of history, you know, generally, do you know how things flowed? But then what I've learned as an adult is that, you know, okay, I had the good general sense of that, but there's some really important specific things sometimes that are in there that get lost when you're getting that general flow of American history. You know, it's interesting to me, you know, I mentioned there's 3 times normally that we do American history in our normal way of doing things. You know, it's the, I want to say it's around 3rd or 4th grade, we do it again, then we do it again in 8th grade, we do it in 11th grade, it was when I was going through. And the level of detail that you go into is obviously different because of where you are in terms of being able to understand as a student at that point. You know, if you get the story of the first Thanksgiving, and generally speaking, these people came across the ocean and Columbus came across in a boat, in the early, your first version of American history, you got the first thing you're probably going to grasp. In the 8th grade version, you're probably going to get something a little bit more advanced and understand that there was this American Revolution and a little bit about what that is. But again, you're probably only going to get the very high level pass of that. You know, in 11th grade, you're certainly going to get more. And if you take a similar course in college, you're going to get whatever you get from that. But I think where I suffered, I had an okay world history teacher in high school when I was, you know, I was in honors classes, so we probably got a little bit better than most did. But you know what I do know, unfortunately, and no knock on this, especially when this is, you know, a lot of history gets taught by a lot of coaches in a lot of in a lot of settings, and it's not their primary. Not that they're not competent to do it, but they don't probably have the passion for it. And I do believe that history normally gets derived from, do you have a teacher who's able to give you some kind of passion for it, to help you understand how this connects to you? Because otherwise, you know, even in what we've done here, okay, Luther hammered some paper on a door. So what? Well, it's a pretty big so what.
Yeah.
But so just knowing that doesn't mean you understand how that applies to you now. And I think that's the tough part that we struggle with. You know, in all honesty, the Bible history is a lot of that too. I think where, this is just my personal opinion, but where most people suffer where a lot of Christians suffer in terms of understanding how to read and interpret their Bible better, is they don't understand the historical backdrop of the Old Testament or the New Testament. And you know, we've talked about this before. You know, what is your hermeneutic, right? What is your way of interpreting Scripture? Well, I believe the best hermeneutic, we talked about this, is a historical, grammatical hermeneutic. The historical part is what was going on when it was written, by whom it was written, and to whom it was written to. And the grammatical is, what does it actually mean and say? Yeah. And so if you don't have the historical, all you've got is the grammatic, you're probably going to miss something. If all you focus on the historical and you don't look at the language, you're going to miss something. So the history becomes critical to understand what's going on. And we're as Americans, we're bad. The world generally is a bad student of history. As Americans, I think we are particularly poor with our study of history and geography. It tends not to be the thing that we focus a lot on, or our perspectives on it are simple is okay and simple is good, but don't stay at simple, because there's a lot more complexity of what's really going on behind the scenes in a lot of things.
Yeah, a friend of mine, we were we were talking about the Baylor history department, and I laughed that we were up there a couple of years ago, and I went up to see if any of the professors were still there. There were a couple of people who had been like grad students when I was there, now professors, but I had to laugh because the offices looked exactly the same. The doors that were wooden when I was there, and most of the doors have been replaced with aluminum glass doors. But otherwise, I swear there were still some of the same desks and office furniture. You know, nothing has changed. And as Frank said, you know, there's no money in history. I mean, we have two new science buildings, beautiful new science buildings, because there's a lot of money in science and business, but there's just not much money in history, so there's not much emphasis there.
And
I think
that's the same thing.
Americans probably, at least until probably a generation or two ago, were probably better students of history than I'd say most Europeans possibly. But now we're not. And even then we were very chauvinistic. And I am very chauvinistic in my view of history. I tend to think of world history revolving around American history. And unfortunately, that's how I learned it in high school. I had a couple of pretty good teachers, but the emphasis was still on what happened in the world and how it affected the United States.
A good example would be, I won't keep mentioning the podcast, but did a recent episode here with one of the guys that contributes to the podcast, who is very much a student of history. And he is very much a student of 19th century European history, so he fills in a nice gap for me because that is not one of my areas of strength. But we were talking there about, and we were specifically, actually, the episode was specifically on when the draft, when the Selective Service Act was retained here a few months before the outbreak for the United States of World War II. It was in August of 19. It was in 1940 that the U.S. instituted its first peacetime draft. That came up for sunset review a year later, and Sam Rayburn, by one vote, gavelled it through the House to be sustained in August of 1941. Well, in December of 1941 was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, so it made a difference that we had people that were still enlisted, that had been enlisted through the draft, that were still there when we started the war. But that actually led us, the reason I'm bringing this up, that led us to have a conversation when we were talking about that is, okay, what year did World War II start? You ask most Americans, they will tell you World War II was 1941 to 1945. And the reason they will select those dates, that was the United States formal participation in the war began in December of 1941 and ended when the conflict was over in 1945. I guarantee you, if you were Poland, you're going to think 1939 is the right year to spend. I think the way that I normally think of World War I is that World War II is I think of it as 1939 to 1945. That also now takes a very European view of the war, because you could argue the Japanese aggression into China, which began in 35 and 37, is actually the start of the precursor to the Pacific War. So when did World War II start? Well, it all depends on your viewpoint. If you want to look at it from purely an American viewpoint, 1941. The European viewpoint, from an English viewpoint, 1939. From a Chinese viewpoint, the mid 1930s. And that's to your point. We learn a lot of our world history through the optic of American participation in that.
Same thing for World War One.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. World War One, 1917.
1917.
Yeah, for us. What's an archduke? How did he get assassinated? How did this start, kind of thing, in 1914? And the way I'll tie that back over, we've been talking about, our theology, I think, works a lot that way too. Our understanding of historical theology. We see it through the prism of what we know, and we don't always see it through the prism of the things that aren't directly, in our mind, contributing to that flow. I think we see Reformation theology. Yeah, we understand the value of Luther. Do we fully grasp the value of an Augustine? Do we fully grasp the value of an Aquinas, who is pre-Reformation, in terms of how that is? Probably not. And even if we study it, we probably don't, because we have to make the effort to do that.
Hey, just to let Diane and Sherry know, we did prayer requests earlier. Are you still recording?
Yes, I need to stop.
Because of the difficulty we were having getting connected.